Hey guys, tonight we are stepping out of our cozy, centrally heated lives and straight into a landscape that looks like a high definition photograph of the end of the world. Imagine standing in the middle of the Great Plains in the late 1700s, where the horizon isn't a line but a blurred, vibrating haze of white on white. The air is so cold it feels sharp, like you are breathing in tiny, microscopic shards of glass that want to settle in your lungs and stay there. Your eyelashes are already beginning to fuse together with every blink, and the wind, a relentless, howling beast that has traveled 1,000 miles just to ruin your day, is currently trying to find every single gap in your clothing. You probably won't survive this without some serious indigenous engineering, mostly because your modern sensibilities are about as useful here as a solar-powered flashlight in a coal mine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know where you are watching from tonight and what time it is for you. Is it a rainy midnight in London or maybe a crisp morning in Sydney? Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through knee-deep drifts of powder that have the consistency of granulated sugar. Every step is a deliberate, exhausting battle against a gravity that seems heavier in the cold. To your left and right, there are no trees to break the wind, no hills to hide behind. It is just you and a temperature of 30 degrees Celsius. At this level of cold, physics starts to act a little weird. If you were to throw a cup of hot water into the air right now, it wouldn't hit the ground. It would turn into a cloud of shimmering ice crystals before it even left your sightline. Your breath doesn't just drift away, it hangs in the air like a thick, ghostly veil, a physical manifestation of your own heat escaping into the void. It's a bit like having a DIY smoke machine following you around, except the smoke is actually your life force leaving your body. In this environment, nature isn't a beautiful backdrop for a hike, it's an active antagonist. The Great Plains in winter are essentially a giant open-air wind tunnel. Because there are no geographical barriers, the wind can reach speeds that make a modern gale look like a gentle ceiling fan on its lowest setting. This is the big sky country, but right now, the sky looks heavy. A bruised purple-gray that promises more snow. You look down at your hands, and even through thick hide mittens, you can feel the thrum of the frost. It's a deep, aching cold that bypasses the skin and goes straight for the bone. It feels less like a temperature and more like a physical weight, a crushing pressure that demands you either find shelter or become part of the permafrost. To a modern observer, the idea of living out here in anything less than a concrete bunker with a nuclear-powered furnace seems like a death sentence. We are used to thermostats that we can flick with a finger, complaining if the room drops to a chilly 18 degrees Celsius. Out here, 18 degrees C is a distant, feverish dream, but as you look across the valley, you see them. A cluster of conical structures, dark against the blinding white of the snow. These are tipis, the ultimate mobile homes of the nomadic tribes like the Lakota, Blackfoot, and Cheyenne. From a distance, they look fragile, like paper hats dropped in a frozen field. But as you get closer, you realize they are masterpieces of aerodynamic and thermal engineering. They aren't just tents, they are sophisticated survival pods designed by people who viewed this brutal winter not as a disaster, but as a season to be mastered. A mainstream historical fact you might recall from school is that these tribes were almost entirely nomadic, their entire lifestyle revolving around the movement of the buffalo herds. But what textbooks often skip is the sheer terrifying logistics of doing that in a blizzard. You aren't just camping, you are maintaining a civilization on the move in a climate that wants to turn you into a popsicle. One quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit that seasoned hunters used to talk about was the sound of the ice crack. When the temperature drops fast enough, The moisture inside the few scattered cottonwood trees near frozen riverbeds can actually freeze and expand so rapidly that the trees explode with a sound like a rifle shot. If you hear that, you know the deep cold has arrived and it's time to double down on your insulation. You reach the edge of the camp, and the first thing you notice isn't the cold, but the smell. It's a rich, heavy cocktail of wood smoke, dried meat, and the earthy, musky scent of buffalo hides. It's a warm smell, if that makes sense, the kind of scent that promises safety. The tipis are arranged in a wide circle, a formation designed to help break the wind and create a shared pocket of slightly calmer air in the center. Even the way they are positioned is calculated. The doors almost always face east, away from the prevailing winter winds that scream in from the west and north. It's like the entire village is collectively turning its back on the storm, a silent architectural no thank you to the Arctic blast. Historians still argue whether the frequency of winter migrations was driven more by food shortages or the sheer psychological need for a change of scenery. Some suggest that staying in one place too long made the tribe vulnerable to enemies or depleted the local firewood too quickly, while others argue that the movement was a spiritual necessity, a way to stay in rhythm with the earth even when it was sleeping under 10 feet of snow. Regardless of the reason, you are here now, and you need to understand how these structures actually work. You walk toward one of the larger Tipis. It stands about 20 feet tall, a perfect cone of dark tan leather. At the very top, 2 ears or smoke flaps flutter in the wind, looking like the wings of a giant bird. These flaps are the smart tech of the 18th century. By adjusting 2 external poles, the inhabitants can change the shape of the smoke hole to account for whichever way the wind is blowing. It ensures that the fire inside stays lit and the people inside don't end up smoked like a side of bacon. As you stand there, the wind gives one final spiteful shove, sending a swirl of snow down your collar. You realize that your boots, even though they are made of sturdy leather, are starting to feel like blocks of ice. The transition from the vast, terrifying openness of the plains to the intimate, controlled environment of the teepee is about to be the most important move of your life. You reach for the heavy hide door, which is weighted with a wooden lath to keep it from flapping. It's the original draft excluder. Behind that door lies a world where the laws of the blizzard are suspended, replaced by the crackle of a small fire and the ancient wisdom of a people who knew that to survive the winter, you didn't fight the cold, you outsmarted it. To understand why you aren't currently a human ice cube, you have to look at the bones of this structure. You step closer to the teepee, brushing a thick layer of frost off the side, and you see where the heavy hide cover meets the wooden skeleton at the bottom. These aren't just random branches picked up from a riverbank. These are lodgepole pine poles. And in the world of 18th century architecture, they are the equivalent of high-grade structural steel. You run your gloved hand along the wood, feeling the straightness of the grain. If these poles were crooked or weak, the weight of the winter snow or the sheer force of a midnight gale would snap them like toothpicks, leaving you very exposed and very dead in a matter of minutes. The lodgepole pine is nature's version of a prefabricated building kit. These trees grow in dense, crowded stands where they have to compete for sunlight, which forces them to grow incredibly tall, thin, and straight. Exactly what you need when you're building a portable skyscraper. You realize that getting these poles wasn't exactly a trip to the local hardware store. The tribes often had to travel hundreds of miles to the foothills of the mountains to harvest them. Imagine dragging 20-foot poles across a trackless prairie without a truck. It's the ultimate high-stakes IKEA run, except instead of a flat-pack box that fits in your hatchback, you're hauling a dozen tree trunks behind a dog or a horse. You look up at the peak where the poles intersect. It's a complex, interlaced web of timber that would make a modern civil engineer nod in approval. Most tipis are built on a foundation of either 3 or 4 primary poles lashed together with a heavy rawhide rope. This creates a tripod or quadpod that serves as the anchor for the rest of the structure. It's like the chassis of a car. Everything else just hangs off it. Once that anchor is up, the other 15 to 20 poles are leaned into the crotches of the main ones. It's a bit like a game of giant Jenga, but with the added pressure that if you mess up the balance, your house falls on your head while you're sleeping. A mainstream historical fact you might have missed is that a standard tipi required about 15 to 20 of these poles, each ranging from 18 to 25 feet in length. This provided enough surface area to support a cover made of 12 to 18 buffalo hides. It's a lot of weight to balance on a single point, but the conical shape is a stroke of genius. It distributes the weight downward and outward, making it incredibly stable. You could probably park a small modern sedan on top of a well-built tipi frame, and it might just hold, though I wouldn't recommend trying it, mostly because the neighbors would have questions and the insurance claim would be hilarious. The wood itself is seasoned and peeled. You can see the smooth, pale surface of the pine where the bark has been stripped away. This isn't just for aesthetics. Bark holds moisture and invites rot, and when it's 30 degrees C, moisture is your absolute worst enemy. You want the wood to be as dry and dead as possible so it doesn't warp or snap when the temperature swings. There's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit among some northern tribes that they would actually sing to the poles while peeling them, believing that the wood needed to be coaxed into its new life as a protector of the family. If the wood listened, it wouldn't crack during the great cold. It sounds superstitious until you're the one lying under a ton of timber during a blizzard, at which point you'd probably start singing show tunes to the poles if you thought it would help. Historians still argue whether the preference for a 3-pole versus a 4-pole base was a matter of structural necessity based on regional wind patterns or simply a long-standing cultural tradition passed down through generations. The 3-pole base is generally considered more stable on uneven ground. Think of a 3-legged stool that never wobbles, while the 4-pole base provides a bit more interior room and a more circular floor plan. Either way, when the wind hits 60 miles per hour, you aren't thinking about geometry. You're thinking about the fact that your mobile home is currently vibrating like a giant tuning fork. You notice that the poles extend a few feet above the top of the hide cover, creating a sort of wooden crown. In the summer, this looks decorative, but in the winter, it serves a dark, practical purpose. These extensions break up the wind as it whistles over the top of the cone, preventing a vacuum from forming that could suck the heat right out of the smoke hole. It's an aerodynamic spoiler, much like you'd see on the back of a racing car, designed to manage airflow. Except here, the stakes aren't a trophy. It's the ability to keep your toes from turning into popsicles. Modern campers usually deal with tent poles made of carbon fiber or aluminum that weigh about as much as a sandwich. These pine poles, however, are heavy, solid, and surprisingly flexible. In a high wind, the teepee doesn't stand rigid like a brick wall. It breathes. You can see the poles slightly flexing, absorbing the energy of the gusts rather than resisting them. It's a difference between a glass bottle and a plastic one. One shatters under pressure while the other just deforms and bounces back. You have to admire the sheer audacity of building a home that is designed to wobble. It's less like a house and more like a very large, very heavy umbrella that has been anchored into the frozen earth. As you stand there, the smell of the pine is faint but present, a sharp, resinous tang that cuts through the smell of the snow. You imagine the effort it took to harvest these. You'd have to find a stand of trees, fell them, strip them of every branch, and then peel the bark using a bone or stone scraper. Then, you'd have to let them dry in the sun for weeks. If you used green wood, it would be too heavy to transport and would eventually bow under its own weight. This was a long-term investment. A good set of poles was a prized possession, often kept for years and handed down, despite the literal drag of moving them across the plains. You reach out and tap one of the poles. It makes a dull, solid thwack. This is your fortress. It's just wood and physics, but in this environment, it feels more substantial than any skyscraper. You realize that the geometry of the teepee is what allows it to survive. The wide base and the tapering top mean that the wind has nothing to grab onto. The wind just slides around the curved surface, much like water flows around a stone in a river. It's an elegant solution to a brutal problem. The next step, of course, is the skin, the heavy, waterproof, wind-breaking shell that turns this wooden skeleton into a living space. But for a moment, you just appreciate the poles. Without them, you're just a person standing in a field of snow, and the planes have a very efficient way of dealing with people who don't have a plan. You take one last look at the crown of the teepee, silhouetted against the darkening violet sky, and prepare to see how these bones are covered. Now that you have your wooden skeleton standing tall, it's time to talk about the skin of your home. And let me tell you, this is where things get messy. In the modern world, if we want a tent, we go to a big box store and buy something made of ripstop nylon that weighs about as much as a bag of chips. In the 18th century Great Plains, your fabric is walking around on 4 legs, weighs 2,000 pounds, and has a very bad attitude. To cover a teepee, you need buffalo hides, specifically a lot of them. We're talking about 12 to 18 massive skins for a single family lodge. If you've ever tried to move a wet rug, you have a vague idea of the weight, but imagine that rug is the size of a small billboard and made of thick, fibrous animal protein. Processing these hides is less like a craft project and more like an Olympic-level endurance event mixed with a biology lab. First, the hides have to be fleshed. You're kneeling on the frozen ground using a scraper made from a sharpened elk tibia to remove every scrap of fat, muscle, and gristle from the inside of the skin. It's rhythmic, grueling work. The sound is a wet, repetitive schlip-schlap that eventually becomes the background music of your life. If you leave even a tiny bit of fat on there, the hide will rot or become a magnet for every hungry wolf in a 50-mile radius. And having a predator try to eat your living room wall while you're inside it is generally considered a bad way to spend an evening. Once the hide is clean, it's not yet the soft, supple leather you might imagine. Right now, it's raw hide. When it dries, it becomes as stiff and unforgiving as a sheet of plywood. If you try to wrap a teepee in untreated rawhide, the first time it rained or snowed, the whole thing would sag, and then it would dry into a shriveled, distorted mess that looked like a giant wrinkled prune. To prevent this, the tribes used a process that sounds like a plot point from a low-budget horror movie, but is actually a stroke of chemical genius: brain tanning. Here's your quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit. Every animal, according to indigenous wisdom and verified by modern chemistry, has just enough brains in its head to tan its own hide. You take the buffalo's brains, simmer them into a sort of gray smoothie, and rub that oily, fatty mixture deep into the fibers of the skin. The emulsified fats in the brain tissue coat the microscopic fibers, preventing them from sticking together as they dry. It's essentially the 19th century version of a deep conditioning hair treatment, but for a dead animal's skin. It's gross, it's pungent, and it's the only reason your house doesn't turn into a suit of armor the moment the humidity changes. A mainstream historical fact you'll find in most ethnographic records is that the primary labor of tanning and maintaining the teepee cover fell to the women of the tribe. This wasn't just a chore, it was a high-status engineering role. A woman who could produce a perfectly white, soft, and durable teepee cover was the equivalent of a master architect today. She had to coordinate the stitching of those 18 hides using sinew, the tough, thread-like tendons from the buffalo's back, which had to be processed and dried until it was stronger than modern industrial fishing line. When you sew hides together with sinew, the material actually expands when it gets wet. sealing the needle holes and making the entire structure naturally waterproof. It's the original seam sealing, no fancy chemicals required, but there's one more step before the cover is ready for a 30-degree C blizzard. And this leads us to a point where historians still argue whether the practice was primarily for function or for form: the smoking of the hides. Once the cover was sewn and stretched, it was often hung over a slow burning fire of damp wood or pine cones. This gave the leather a deep, rich amber or chocolate brown color. Some scholars argue that the smoke was mostly for aesthetics or to mask the organic smell of the hides. However, others point out that the smoke chemicals, specifically the formaldehydes and tars, coated the fibers, making the leather much more resistant to water and preventing it from becoming stiff after a heavy soaking. It's the difference between a cheap leather jacket that gets ruined in the rain and a high-end waterproofed trench coat. As you stand inside the completed teepee later on, you'll notice the texture of the walls. They aren't cold and clinical like plastic, they feel alive. The surface is slightly fuzzy, which helps trap a thin layer of air, providing a tiny bit of extra insulation. This material is essentially 19th century Gore-Tex. It breathes, allowing moisture from your breath to escape so the interior doesn't become a damp cave, but it blocks the wind with the efficiency of a brick wall. When the wind howls outside, the hide cover tautens against the poles, vibrating with a low bass hum that you eventually find soothing. It's the sound of the buffalo protecting you, even after the buffalo itself is long gone. You also have to consider the sheer physics of moving this thing. A dry teepee cover made of buffalo hides can weigh anywhere from 100 to 150 pounds. When it gets wet or frozen, that weight can double. You aren't just living in a tent, you're living in a heavy-duty piece of equipment. In the winter, the bottom of the hide is often weighted down with heavy stones or pegged deep into the frozen earth. Some people would even pile snow around the base, a technique called banking, to create an airtight seal. It's like adding a foundation of frozen insulation to your home. The smell of a freshly tanned and smoked teepee is something you never forget. It's a mix of old wood smoke, the sharp tang of the tanning brains, and the sweet, grassy scent of the plains. It's an expensive smell, representing hundreds of hours of back-breaking labor and a dozen successful hunts. In a world where everything you own has to be earned through physical grit, the teepee cover is your most valuable asset. It is the barrier between you and a cold, indifferent universe. As the sun begins to set on your first day in the camp, the light filters through the amber-colored hides, giving the interior a warm, golden glow. It's a bit like being inside a giant glowing lantern. Even though it's 40 degrees below freezing, just a few inches away, the light makes you feel safe. You realize that this leather bag you're living in is a sophisticated composite material, optimized over thousands of years to do exactly one thing: keep you from becoming a part of the landscape. You run your hand over a seam, feeling the incredible strength of the sinew, and you start to understand that primitive is a word used only by people who have never had to build their own survival pod from scratch. You stand outside for a moment longer, watching the way the wind interacts with these structures, and it's then you realize that the teepee is essentially the 18th century equivalent of a stealth fighter jet, built with a geometry that treats the wind not as an obstacle, but as a guest that just needs to be shown the exit. If you were to try and pitch a modern, square-walled cabin out here on the open tundra, the wind would treat those flat walls like a giant sail. Within an hour, your lovely little rectangular home would be somewhere in the next territory, and you'd be left standing there holding a very expensive door handle. But the teepee is the ultimate aerodynamic middle finger to the northern gale. If you look closely, you'll notice something that most people miss in the drawings. The teepee isn't actually a perfect symmetrical cone. It's a bit tilted. The back of the lodge The side facing the wind is steeper and flatter, while the front is more sloped. This isn't because the builders were eyeballing it after a long day. It's a deliberate design choice. By making the windward side steeper, the structure presents a lower profile to the strongest gusts. The wind hits that slope and is forced to split and flow around the curved sides, much like air flows over the wing of a plane. Instead of the wind pushing the teepee over, the pressure actually helps pin the structure more firmly to the ground. It's an incredible bit of passive stability. You're essentially using the wind's own strength to keep your house from moving. It's like a judo move, but with architecture. A mainstream historical fact that often gets overlooked in the Wild West movies is that the tilting of the cone served a dual purpose. It created more headroom in the back where people slept and sat, while also moving the smoke hole slightly forward of the center. This asymmetry is what makes the interior livable. If it were a perfect circle, the wind would create a vortex at the top that would shove all the smoke right back down into your eyes. Instead, the shape creates a low pressure zone on the leeward side of the peak, which literally sucks the smoke out of the lodge. It's a natural ventilation system that doesn't require a single moving part or a lithium-ion battery. You watch as a particularly nasty gust of wind, the kind that would make a modern car shudder on the highway, slams into the camp. You see the buffalo hide covers tighten. They don't flap like a cheap nylon tent. They drum. There's a low frequency vibration that you can feel in your teeth. This brings us to a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit that was well known to the elders of the plains. The teepee acts as a primitive barometer. Because the hide is an organic material, it reacts to the moisture and pressure in the air. When a big storm is rolling in, the hides tighten and the pitch of the wind whistling through the poles changes. A skilled inhabitant could literally hear a blizzard coming before the first snowflake even fell. It's like having a weather app that speaks in the language of bass notes and creaking wood. Historians still argue whether the specific degree of tilt in the teepee was a standardized engineering measurement passed down through apprenticeships or if it was instinctively adjusted by each family based on the specific microclimate of their wintering grounds. Some argue that the Crow and the Blackfoot had distinct aerodynamic signatures in their designs, optimized for the different wind speeds of the high plains versus the mountain foothills. It's a kind of subtle architectural debate that keeps researchers up at night, but out here, the only peer review that matters is whether your roof stays on when the thermometer hits 30 degrees Celsius. You might be wondering why the snow isn't burying these structures. On a flat-roofed house, 3 feet of snow is a structural emergency that involves you climbing a ladder with a shovel while cursing your life choices. On a teepee, the steep 60-degree angle of the walls means that snow simply can't gain a foothold. Gravity does all the work for you. Most of the snow slides right off the smooth, smoked leather and piles up around the base. This, ironically, is exactly what you want. That ring of snow at the bottom acts as a secondary windbreak and extra insulation, sealing the gap between the hide and the frozen ground. It's like the teepee is building its own snow skirt to keep its feet warm. The physics of the cone also means that the center of gravity is incredibly low. Most of the weight, the heavy poles, the thickest part of the hides, and the people themselves is concentrated in the bottom third of the structure. This makes it nearly impossible to tip over. You could have a wind strong enough to peel the paint off a modern barn, and the teepee would just sit there, vibrating slightly, anchored by its own geometry. It's a bit like those Weeble Wobble toys from the 70s. The wind can push it, but the structure is always trying to return to its center. Think about the modern tiny house movement for a second. People spend tens of thousands of dollars on high-tech insulation and aerodynamic trailers, yet they still struggle with wind resistance and heating efficiency. Here, You have a home that can be packed up in 20 minutes, moved by a single horse, and yet it uses the laws of thermodynamics more effectively than a modern suburban home. The cone shape creates a natural convection current. As the fire in the center heats the air, that air rises. Because the space narrows toward the top, the air speeds up. This is the Venturi effect for the science nerds out there, and carries the smoke and stale air out the top while drawing fresh, though very cold, air in from the bottom. You notice the way the light hits the teepee. Because it's a curved surface, there are no hard shadows and there's nowhere for the wind to hook in. Even the pegs used to hold the hide down are angled into the wind, using the soil's resistance to create a mechanical lock. Every single inch of this thing has been optimized over 3,000 years of trial and error. There are no accidents in teepee design. Every flap, every peg, and every degree of tilt is there because someone, somewhere, once tried it a different way and probably had a very cold, very miserable night as a result. As you prepare to finally step inside, you take one look back at the vast, frozen emptiness of the plains. In this white void, a square would look like an intruder, a target for the wind to destroy. But the cone looks like it belongs. It looks like a natural landform, like a small leather mountain that has sprouted from the permafrost. You realize that to survive out here, you don't build a fortress to fight nature. You build a shape that nature recognizes. You step toward the door, the wind giving you one last, harmless shove, and you marvel at the fact that a few poles and some buffalo skin are currently winning a fight against the entire Arctic atmosphere. You pull back the heavy door flap and step inside, and the first thing that hits you, even before the heat, is the silence. It's a thick, heavy silence that swallows the roar of the wind. Outside, the world is screaming, but in here, the atmosphere is as still as a library at 3 a.m. You drop the door flap and it thuds shut, sealing you into a space that feels impossibly far removed from the white hell you just left. You expect it to be freezing, but it's not. It's actually comfortable. You aren't shivering anymore. Your face, which felt like it was being sandblasted by ice 5 seconds ago, begins to prickle as the blood flow returns. As you look around, you realize you aren't actually looking at the walls you saw from the outside. There is a second skin in here. This is the inner liner, or what some tribes call the dew claw, or lining. If the outer teepee cover is the heavy, waterproof shell of a winter parka, this liner is the fleece lining that actually does the heavy lifting of keeping you warm. It's a ring of hides that stands about 4 to 6 feet high, lashed to the interior of the poles. It doesn't reach the top, it just creates a sort of high-walled room within a room. This is the secret sauce of plains architecture. Without this, you're just in a very fancy, very cold windbreak. With it, you are in a high-efficiency thermal capsule, a mainstream historical fact you'll find in almost any architectural study of indigenous homes is that the inner liner was essential for moisture control and ventilation. But the physics of it are even cooler than that. There is a gap of about 4 to 6 inches between the outer cover and this inner liner. In the winter, you don't peg the outer cover all the way to the ground, you leave a tiny gap. Cold air is sucked under the outer wall, flows up behind the liner, and then feeds into the central fire. This creates a constant, gentle curtain of rising air that prevents the smoke from the fire from settling in the living area. It's a convection-driven ventilation system that provides a steady stream of oxygen to the fire while keeping the people in a pocket of dead air that stays warm. It's essentially the same principle as a modern double-pane window, where the air trap between the glass acts as a thermal barrier. You reach out and touch the liner. It's made of thinner, softer skins, maybe deer or elk, and it's often decorated with paintings of past battles or family histories. Here's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit. Some families would hang dried buffalo hooves or dew claws along the top edge of the liner. While these were decorative, They also served as a primitive motion sensor alarm system. If a prowler or a hungry wolf tried to sneak under the bottom of the teepee, the vibration would travel up the poles and make the hooves clatter together. It's a low-tech security system that works even when you're fast asleep. A rhythmic click-clack that says someone's at the door and they didn't bring pizza. Looking up, you see another piece of engineering, the ozan. This is a partial ceiling, a horizontal canopy made of hide that stretches across the back half of the teepee right over the sleeping area. It's like a 4-poster bed canopy, but for survival. In the summer, it keeps rain from dripping onto your face. In the winter, it does something even more vital. It traps the rising heat. Warm air from the fire rises, hits the ozan, and gets pushed back down toward the people sitting on the floor. It prevents the heat from just escaping immediately through the smoke hole. Historians still argue whether the ozan was a standard feature for all Plains tribes or a luxury item reserved for the wealthier families who could afford the extra hides and the labor to maintain them. Some argue it was purely for comfort, while others insist it was a structural necessity to protect the inner hearth from the snow dust that can sometimes filter down through the smoke flaps during a heavy blizzard. You sit down on a pile of furs, and for the first time, you notice the temperature difference. It's not just not cold, it's genuinely toasty. If the outside is 30 degrees CC, the area behind the liner, near the floor, might be a steady 15 degrees CC or even 20 degrees CC. That's a 50-degree temperature swing achieved with nothing but physics and animal skins. You could be sitting in here in a light leather shirt while a blizzard is literally trying to flatten the world outside. It feels like a magic trick. You're in a tent, yet you're more comfortable than you'd be in a drafty Victorian mansion with a broken radiator. The liner also serves as a giant blotter for moisture. In a modern tent, your breath eventually condenses on the cold nylon walls and starts dripping on you like a leaky faucet. In the teepee, the inner liner stays warm because it's facing the fire, so moisture doesn't condense on it. Any frost that forms on the outer cover stays on the other side of the liner. You stay dry, and in the winter, dry is the only thing that stands between you and a very permanent nap. The liner is the original moisture wicking technology. You lean back against the liner because there's a gap of air behind it. The wall doesn't feel like ice. It feels like a solid, supportive chair. You look at the way the firelight plays against the skins. The ozone above you creates a sense of intimacy, a ceiling that makes the vast cone of the teepee feel like a cozy bungalow. You realize that living in a teepee isn't about being outdoorsy. It's about creating a controlled, engineered environment that happens to be portable. It's the original van life, but with more buffalo and significantly better insulation. There's a psychological component to this too. In the modern world, we feel safe behind brick and deadbolts. Here, safety is a thin layer of leather, but because of the liner and the ozone, that leather feels like a fortress. You can hear the wind hitting the outer shell, a muffled, distant whoomp whoomp, but you don't feel it. The liner breaks the draft, the ozone traps the heat, and you are left in a pocket of calm. It's a masterclass in using light materials to create heavy-duty protection. As you settle in, you realize you're no longer thinking about the 30 degrees C temperature. You're thinking about how hungry you are or what story you're going to hear tonight. The teepee has done its job. It has demoted the blizzard from a life-threatening catastrophe to background noise. You watch a spark from the fire drift up toward the smoke hole, caught in that perfect convection current created by the gap in the walls. It's a tiny, glowing testament to the fact that humans don't need electricity to be geniuses. They just need to understand how air moves. You look toward the center of the lodge where the real magic is happening. In a modern house, the furnace is hidden in a basement or a closet. A humming mechanical ghost you only think about when the bill arrives. But here, The fire is the literal heart of the home, pulsing in a small, stone-lined pit right in the middle of the floor. This isn't just for warmth, it's your stove, your light source, and your primary entertainment system. However, managing a fire inside a flammable leather cone during a 30°C windstorm is like trying to juggle lit torches in a library. One wrong move, and the bedtime part of the script becomes very literal, very fast. The smoke flaps at the very top of the teepee are the high-tech sensors of this operation. You see two long poles extending outside the teepee, attached to the ears or flaps of the cover. By moving these poles, you can open, close, or pivot the flaps to account for the wind's direction. It's essentially a manual chimney system. If the wind is coming from the north, you close a north flap and open the south one. This creates a vacuum effect. That Venturi effect we talked about that draws the smoke up and out without letting the wind blow it back down into the lodge. If you've ever sat around a campfire and spent the whole night playing musical chairs to avoid the smoke, you'll realize that these flaps are basically a miracle of fluid dynamics. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that the fire in a winter teepee was kept relatively small. You might imagine a roaring bonfire, but that would actually be a disaster. Too much heat would dry out the lodge poles until they became brittle, and it would consume your precious wood supply in hours. Instead, the Plains tribes mastered the long burn. They used a star-shaped fire layout, where long logs were laid out like the spokes of a wheel, with only the tips meeting in the center. As the tips burned away, you simply pushed the logs a few inches further in. It's the original set it and forget it slow cooker technology. However, the fire brings a silent, invisible danger: carbon monoxide. In a sealed modern tent, a small stove can kill you in your sleep. But remember that inner liner trick from earlier? That gap between the outer cover and the liner ensures a constant flow of fresh, oxygen-rich air that feeds the fire from the bottom. The air comes in at floor level, gets heated by the embers, and carries any toxic gases straight up through the smoke hole. It's a perfectly balanced respiratory system for a building. Historians still argue whether the invention of the inner liner was a response to the need for better insulation or specifically to solve the problem of smoke inhalation during the long, sedentary winter months. Some believe the liner only became a standard feature after tribes moved further north into the more brutal Arctic air masses, where sealing the bottom of the teepee became a matter of life and death. Here's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit. Because the teepee is so well ventilated, the air inside is often cleaner than the air in a modern suburban home filled with carpet off-gassing and dust mites. Some early European explorers who were used to the cramped, soot-filled hovels of 18th century Europe were shocked at how fresh a teepee smelled, despite a fire burning in the center and a dozen people living inside. Of course, fresh is a relative term when you haven't showered in 3 weeks and your main floor covering is buffalo hide. But in terms of lung health, the teepee was a Victorian doctor's dream. You watch the way the smoke rises. It doesn't swirl. It moves in a purposeful gray column toward the sky. To keep the fire going through the night without having to stand guard, you use punky wood or tightly packed buffalo chips, dried dung, which burn with a low, steady heat. It's not a bright, flickering flame, but a deep red glow that turns the interior of the teepee into a warm, amber-lit sanctuary. You can see the shadows of your hands dancing on the hide walls. It's incredibly peaceful, provided you don't think too hard about the fact that there is only about half an inch of leather between you and a temperature that can freeze a man's ears off in 10 minutes. One of the subtle skills of teepee living is reading the smoke. If the smoke starts to hang low or curl back down, it means the wind has shifted or a flap needs adjusting. It's a constant, low-stakes game of calibration. You reach for a small stick and poke the embers, sending a tiny constellation of sparks upward. They vanish into the dark circle of the smoke hole, headed for the stars. You realize that this fire isn't just a tool, it's a companion. It's the only thing in this frozen world that is on your side. There's a specific sizzle that happens when a stray snowflake makes it through the smoke hole and hits the hot stones of the fire pit. It's a tiny, sharp sound that reminds you of the chaos outside. But in here, the fire is the boss. It regulates the rhythm of the evening. When the fire is bright, it's time for work or eating. When it sinks to a glow, it's time for sleep. You don't need a watch when you have a hearth. You just need to make sure you have enough fuel to keep the heart beating until the sun decides to show its face again. As you sit there, the warmth from the stones begins to radiate through your moccasins. These stones, the liner of the fire pit, are just as important as the wood. They act as a thermal mass, soaking up the heat during the day and slowly releasing it throughout the night after the flames have died down. It's a primitive radiator system. You could probably turn the fire off completely, and those stones would keep the center of the lodge above freezing for hours. It's all about efficiency. Out here, waste isn't just a bad habit, it's a lethal mistake. You take a deep breath, and the air is dry and warm. The smell of the wood, maybe a bit of cedar or willow, is intoxicating. It makes you feel heavy in a good way. The convection conundrum of how to stay warm without suffocating has been solved by people who didn't even have a word for thermodynamics. They just had a few thousand years of practice and a very strong motivation not to freeze. You lean back, watching the flaps at the top flutter in a particularly strong gust, and you realize that as long as that fire is breathing, you are going to be just fine. You look away from the fire and toward the perimeter of the lodge where your bed awaits. In the modern world, we think of a bed as a mattress on a frame, maybe with some memory foam that promises to cradle our spine while we dream of spreadsheets. But in a winter teepee, your bed is a multi-layered fortress of thermal insulation designed to solve a very specific, very deadly problem: the permafrost. You see, the ground you are sitting on isn't just cold, it is a massive heat-sucking battery that has been charging at 30-degree soarings for months. If you were to lie directly on the earth, it would pull the warmth out of your body with the efficiency of an industrial refrigerator. You wouldn't wake up, not because you were tired, but because your core temperature would drop faster than a stone in a well. To combat this, your sleeping area is a masterpiece of layering. First, you have a thick mat of woven reeds or willow branches. These aren't just for comfort, they provide a structural air gap between you and the frozen dirt. Think of it like the box spring of the 18th century, but instead of metal coils, you're using the natural springiness of wood to create a pocket of dead air. On top of that, you lay down the heavy-duty hides, usually the thicker, coarser skins from an old bull buffalo. These act as the subfloor of your bed. By the time you actually get to the furs you'll be sleeping under, you are already 6 inches off the ground. You've created a barrier that the permafrost simply can't bridge. A mainstream historical fact you'll find in almost any museum archive is that these bedding piles were often arranged in a U shape around the central fire. This wasn't just to be cozy, it was a matter of survival geometry. By sleeping in a circle around the hearth, everyone benefited from the radiant heat of the stones, and the dead air space created by the inner liner acted as a collective thermal envelope. However, the order of where you slept was strictly dictated by social hierarchy and age. The honor spot, the warmest and safest place, was at the very back of the teepee, directly opposite the door. This was usually reserved for the elders or the head of the household. If you were the low person on the totem pole, you'd be sleeping closer to the door, which is the 18th century equivalent of being the person who has to sit in the jump seat of a crowded van for a 10-hour road trip. Now, let's talk about the robes themselves. These aren't the thin, decorative throws you see in home decor stores. A winter buffalo robe is a heavy, 4-inch thick carpet of matted wool and leather. When you wrap yourself in one, the weight is the first thing you notice. It's like a weighted blanket, but with more history and a slightly more organic aroma. The hair of the buffalo is hollow, much like a polar bear's fur, which makes it one of the most effective natural insulators on the planet. Here's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit that mountain men and tribes alike swore by: you always sleep with the hair side in. Modern logic might suggest putting the hair outside to look pretty, but the indigenous wisdom was that the hair traps a layer of air directly against your skin, which your body heat then warms up. It's like wearing a 10-pound sweater that also happens to be a sleeping bag. If you sleep hair side out, you're just warming the room, hair side in, and you're warming you. Historians still argue whether the transition from using mostly buffalo robes to wool blankets provided by European traders was a step forward in comfort or a catastrophic decline in winter survival rates. Some argue that wool, while lighter and easier to wash, lacked the wind-breaking properties and the massive thermal heft of a brain-tanned buffalo skin. In a 30-degree-C blizzard, a wool blanket is a nice accessory, but a buffalo robe is a life support system. Some scholars suggest that the increased mortality rates during harsh winters in the late 19th century were partially due to the loss of these heavy traditional robes as the buffalo herds were decimated. You crawl into your nest and the feeling is instantaneous. The furs are soft despite their rugged appearance. You feel the crackle of the dry leather as it settles around you. You aren't just under the covers, you are inside them. You realize that you've created a microclimate. Inside your robe, the temperature might be a balmy 30 degrees C, fueled entirely by your own metabolism. You look over at the other members of the lodge. Families often slept together for warmth, a practice that modern people, with our obsession with personal space, might find cramped. But out here, personal space is just another way to say hypothermia. Body heat is a shared resource. You're all part of the same biological furnace. There's a specific sensory experience to this that you won't find in a history book. It's the sound of the buffalo hair rubbing against itself, a soft, muffled shur every time you move. And then there's the smell. It's the scent of the deep earth, a bit of dried sage that might have been tucked into the furs to keep away lice, and the lingering sweet musk of the animal. It's a primal smell that speaks to safety. In this nest, the terrifying scale of the Great Plains shrinks down to the size of your own body. You are no longer a tiny speck in a white void. You are the master of a very small, very warm, and very furry kingdom. As you lie there, you notice that the ozon, the ceiling canopy we talked about, is glowing faintly from the fire's embers. It feels like you're in a cave within a cave. You reach out a hand and touch the willow backrest that some use to sit up in bed. It's flexible and smooth, a piece of ergonomic furniture that would look right at home in a high-end Scandinavian design studio. It's also civilized. You expect roughing it, but this is refined it. Every piece of bedding, from the grass mats to the heavy robes, is part of a calculated defense in depth against the cold. You watch your breath hitch in the air, but it doesn't bother you. Your body is warm, your feet are tucked into a fold of fur, and the weight of the robe feels like a giant protective hand pressing you down into the earth. You realize that comfort is a relative term. In a house with a furnace, comfort is a thermostat setting. Here, comfort is the knowledge that you have successfully outplayed the environment using nothing but the skin of a beast and the branches of a tree. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the soft breathing of the lodge, and you realize that even in a world made of ice, a well-layered bed is the ultimate sanctuary. The fire is a comforting companion, but even the best managed hearth is a hungry beast that requires constant feeding. In the modern world, If you're cold, you might turn a plastic dial on the wall, or perhaps, if you're feeling particularly adventurous, carry a single pre-wrapped bundle of kiln-dried logs from the grocery store to your fireplace. But out here, in the grip of a 30-degree Oaks whiteout, fuel is life, and finding it is a desperate daily scavenger hunt. You can't just step outside and chop down a tree. On the open plains, trees are as rare as a quiet moment in a house full of toddlers. You have to be a specialist in the archaeology of the snow, looking for anything that will burn. You pull on your heavy buffalo hide mittens and step out of the teepee's warm embrace back into the frozen void. The transition is a physical blow. The moisture in your nose freezes instantly, and the wind tries to steal the very breath from your lungs. Your mission is simple: find wood. Usually, the camp is situated near a river or a creek, specifically because that's where the cottonwoods and willows grow. But in a blizzard, these forests are often buried up to their necks in drifts. You aren't looking for lush green branches. Those are full of water and will only hiss and smoke, filling your teepee with a blinding, tear-inducing fog. You are looking for the deadfall, the dry, brittle limbs that have been seasoned by the wind and sun. A mainstream historical fact you might have learned is that Plains tribes were incredibly conservative with their wood use, often moving camp not because they were bored, but because they had literally hollowed out the local firewood supply for miles. But there's a backup fuel source that is both legendary and slightly unappealing to the modern palate: buffalo chips. These are dried patties of buffalo dung. Before you turn your nose up, remember that these animals eat nothing but grass. By the time it passes through their digestive system and dries in the sun and wind, it's essentially a compressed brick of high-quality cellulose and fiber. It's pre-processed biofuel. Here's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit. A well-dried buffalo chip actually burns with a very hot, clear flame and produces almost no smoke and a surprisingly pleasant, slightly sweet herbal odor, sort of like burning very old, very dry grass. In the winter, however, finding them is the challenge. You have to kick through the snow looking for the telltale lumps. Sometimes they are frozen solid to the earth, requiring a stone maul to break them loose. You're essentially mining for poop in a freezer, but when that poop is the only thing standing between you and a frozen toe, it starts to look like gold. Historians still argue whether the scarcity of firewood was the primary driver behind the development of the small fire culture of the plains, or if it was the other way around. The efficiency of the teepee allowed the tribes to occupy territories that other cultures found uninhabitable due to the lack of timber. Some scholars suggest that the tribes actually practiced a form of forest management, pruning dead wood to encourage new growth for future winters. It's a debate between viewing the tribes as purely reactive to their environment or as active architects of their ecosystem. As you trudge through the drifts, dragging a small sled or just carrying a bundle of sticks tied with a leather thrum, you realize the sheer physical cost of warmth. Every calorie you burn searching for fuel has to be replaced by the food you eat. It's a delicate caloric balance sheet. If you spend more energy finding wood than the wood provides in heat, you are effectively dying in slow motion. This is why you see people scavenging for punky wood, the half-rotten, spongy wood found inside old logs. While it doesn't produce a big, pretty flame, it smolders for hours. It's the 18th century equivalent of a low-power mode on your laptop, designed to keep the system running on the bare minimum. You find a fallen cottonwood branch, its bark silvered by the frost. You use a stone-headed axe to break it into manageable chunks. Each clack of the stone against the wood sounds like a gunshot in the silent, frozen air. You have to be careful. In this cold, stone and wood both become brittle. If you strike too hard at the wrong angle, your tool might shatter. And a broken axe in winter is a disaster on par with a modern person losing their phone and their car keys in the same day. You work quickly, the movement keeping your blood flowing, but you have to watch for the white patch on your nose or cheeks, the first sign of frostbite. It's a race against the clock. The logistics of fuel management inside the teepee are just as disciplined. You don't just toss logs on the fire whenever you feel like it, you categorize your stash. The high quality dry willow is saved for cooking or when you need light to work on a tool. The heavy, slow burning cottonwood is for the overnight maintenance fire. The buffalo chips are for the quick bursts of heat. You are your own utility company, managing a complex grid of energy sources. You realize that boredom isn't really a thing in the winter. You are far too busy being a logistics manager for your own survival. There's a certain satisfaction when you return to the teepee, dumping your haul near the door. The sound of the dry wood hitting the ground is a promise of continued life. You take a few pieces and carefully feed them into the center of the wheel-shaped fire. The flames lick the new wood, turning the silver bark into glowing orange embers. The smell of the fresh smoke, that warm smell we talked about, fills the space again. You've earned another 6 hours of safety. As you sit back down, rubbing your hands together to bring the feeling back, you look at the pile of wood and chips. It doesn't look like much, but in the context of the 30-degree world outside, it's a treasure hoard. You realize that out here, the definition of wealth isn't how much stuff you have. It's how much time you've bought yourself before the cold catches up. You've just bought yourself another night. You lean back against the willow backrest, watching the fire consume a particularly large buffalo chip, and you marvel at the fact that the secret to conquering the Arctic was literally lying on the ground, waiting for someone with enough sense to pick it up. The fire is roaring and your shelter is secure, but there is a persistent, gnawing rumble in your stomach that no amount of warmth can ignore. In the modern world, when you're hungry, you might grab a protein bar or order a pizza that arrives in 30 minutes. Out here, your body is a high-performance engine running in extreme conditions, and it is currently burning through calories like a sports car with a fuel leak. At 30 degrees C, you aren't just eating for pleasure, you are eating to keep your internal furnace from flaming out. You need fat, lots of it. In this environment, a salad would be a death sentence. You need the ultimate survival superfood, pemmican. You reach for a leather pouch kept near the fire, and inside are what look like small, dark, unassuming bricks. This is pemmican, and it is arguably the most concentrated form of energy ever devised by human intelligence. It's a mixture of lean, dried buffalo meat that has been pounded into a powder mixed with rendered buffalo tallow, fat, and often spiked with dried chokecherries or service berries for a bit of vitamin C and flavor. It doesn't look like much. In fact, it looks a bit like a piece of chocolate-colored sweet, but it is a marvel of food engineering. It is shelf-stable for years, requires no cooking, and packs a caloric punch that would make a modern keto influencer weep with joy. A mainstream historical fact you might find in the journals of the Hudson's Bay Company is that pemmican was so vital to the survival of the fur trade that it literally sparked a small-scale conflict known as the Pemmican War in the early 1800s. Traders and indigenous people alike knew that without these fat-heavy rations, traveling across the frozen plains was impossible. 1 pound of pemmican is nutritionally equivalent to about 4 to 5 pounds of fresh meat. It's the original emergency ration, but unlike the chalky bars found in modern disaster kits, this stuff actually tastes like a rich, savory, slightly fruity jerky cake. Here's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit. Because pemmican is so dense in fat, it has a very low freezing point. Even when it's 40 below zero, pemmican doesn't turn into a rock. It stays slightly pliable, like very cold fudge. You can take a bite of it and it immediately starts to melt on your tongue, releasing a surge of energy that you can almost feel hitting your bloodstream. There's an old frontiersman saying that a man can live on pemmican and water indefinitely, and while that sounds like a miserable diet to us, when you're tramping through 3 feet of snow. It tastes like a 5-course meal at a Michelin star restaurant. Historians still argue whether the addition of berries to pemmican was primarily for nutrition to prevent scurvy, or if it was a clever way to adjust the pH of the fat to keep it from going rancid over long periods. Some argue that the berries were purely a luxury for premium batches, while the standard Scout pemmican was just meat and fat. Regardless of the recipe, the ratio was the key. You wanted about 50% fat by weight. In our world, fat is a scary word on a nutrition label. Out here, fat is the holy grail. It provides sustained energy that burns slowly, keeping you warm for hours after you've eaten. You take a small knife, made of traded steel or perhaps a sharp flake of obsidian, and shave off a few slices of the dark brick. As you chew, the richness of the tallow coats your mouth. It's a heavy, satisfying sensation. You also have a bowl of wasna, a similar mixture that might include crushed corn or nuts. To wash it down, you aren't drinking ice-cold water. That would drop your core temperature. Instead, you have a horn cup of hot broth made from boiled buffalo bones. This bone soup is full of marrow and minerals, a liquid gold that warms you from the inside out. The way you eat in the winter is also a lesson in thermodynamics. You don't eat one big meal and call it a day. You graze. You keep your metabolism stoked by eating small amounts of high-fat food throughout the day and night. If you've ever noticed how a dog shivers when it's cold to generate heat, you're doing the same thing, just on a chemical level. Your body is performing thermogenesis, and pemmican is the high-octane gasoline for that process. You can feel a literal heat wave spread through your chest about 20 minutes after eating a few ounces of the stuff. There's a social element to this too. In the winter teepee, food is shared with an almost religious intensity. If one family has pemmican, everyone has pemmican. Hoarding food in a winter camp is the ultimate social taboo, mostly because if your neighbor starves and freezes, the strength of the whole circle is weakened. You pass the bowl around, the firelight reflecting in the rich, oily broth. You realize that this diet, so different from our modern ideas of healthy, is the only reason your heart is still beating. Your body is currently a buffalo processing factory, turning grass-fed fat into the heat that keeps the frost at bay. As you finish your portion, you feel a sense of profound lethargy, the fat coma, as some might call it, but here it's a form of protection. Your heart rate slows, your skin feels warm, and the cold air of the teepee no longer feels like an intruder. You look at the leather bag of pemmican hanging from a lodgepole. It's your insurance policy. It doesn't require a refrigerator, it doesn't rot, and it doesn't lose its power. It is a piece of the sun, captured in buffalo fat, waiting to be released into your veins. You lean back, feeling the slow burn energy of the tallow doing its work. You aren't just surviving the winter, you are fueled by it. The buffalo died so you could live, and in this quiet, frozen moment, you feel a deep, visceral connection to the cycle of the plains. The wind can howl all at once, but as long as you have a brick of pemmican and a fire in the hearth, you are the apex predator of the Arctic. You close your eyes for a second, savoring the lingering taste of the choke cherries, and prepare for the long, dark hours ahead where your only job is to stay warm and keep breathing. You fed the fire and you fed your stomach, but now you need to address the spacesuit that allows you to exist in this sub-zero vacuum. In our modern era, we have high-tech synthetic fibers, electric heated socks, and parkas that cost as much as a used car. But if you were to drop a modern mountaineer in the middle of a 30-degree plains blizzard, wearing only their polyester and nylon, they might actually be worse off than you are right now. Why? Because synthetics don't breathe like skin, and in the deep cold, sweat is a silent killer. Out here, your wardrobe is a sophisticated, multi-layered system of brain-tan leather and fur that will make a Savile Row tailor weep with envy. You start with your base layer, the leggings and shirt. These aren't made from the heavy, stiff buffalo hide used for the teepee cover. Instead, they are crafted from the skin of deer or elk. This leather is soft as velvet, having been worked by hand until the fibers are completely broken down and supple. It feels like a second skin against your body. You realize that leather isn't just one material, it's a spectrum. The brain tanning process we talked about earlier is what makes this possible. Because the leather is porous, it allows the moisture from your skin to evaporate and move away from your body. If you are wearing a plastic-based modern jacket and started working hard, your sweat would trap against your skin, cool down, and turn into a layer of ice. In a brain tan shirt, you stay bone dry. A mainstream historical fact you'll find in early ethnographic studies is that the fringe on Native American clothing wasn't just a fashion statement. While it looks cool when you move, those long strips of leather serve a vital engineering purpose in the winter. When it snows or rains, the fringe acts as a series of tiny gutters. Instead of the water soaking into the main body of the garment, it wicks toward the fringe and drips off the ends. It's a passive drainage system that keeps the core of your clothing dry. Additionally, in the summer, the fringe helps swat away flies, but in the winter, it's all about moisture management. It's the original water repellent finish, and it doesn't require a single chemical spray. Here's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit. For your feet, the most vulnerable part of your body, you aren't just wearing moccasins. You are wearing a winter system. You start with a layer of dried buffalo grass or sage stuffed into the toes of your moccasins to act as a disposable insulating sock. Then you put on your moccasins, which for winter are often made hair side in from buffalo calves. But the real secret is the overshoe. In extreme cold, you might wrap your feet in additional squares of heavy fur. Some hunters even talked about using a snowshoe grease, made from a mix of bear fat and charcoal to waterproof the seams. It's a messy, blackened goop, but it prevents the slush from reaching your skin. Historians still argue whether the highly decorative beadwork and quill work found on winter gear were purely for spiritual protection, or if the added weight and thickness of the embroidery actually provided a structural reinforcement to the seams. Some scholars point out that the dense patterns of porcupine quills act like a layer of armor, breaking the wind and adding a minute amount of thermal mass to the chest and shoulders. Others argue that the act of decorating the gear was a psychological necessity, a way to assert your humanity and your culture in a landscape that feels utterly indifferent to your existence. You pull on your capote or winter robe. If you're lucky, it's a tailored coat made from a heavy buffalo hide, complete with a hood. The ruff around the face is usually made of long-haired fur like wolf or wolverine. This isn't just because it looks intimidating. Wolverine fur has a unique structural property. It's one of the few furs that doesn't collect frost from your breath. On a normal wool scarf, your breath would turn into a block of ice within 20 minutes, eventually freezing your face. On a Wolverine ruff, the ice crystals just shake right off. It's an anti-fog and anti-frost technology that modern science is still trying to replicate perfectly with polymers. You look at your mittens, they are huge gauntlet-style affairs that reach almost to your elbows, often connected by a leather cord that goes over your shoulders. This is the 18th century version of toddler strings, and for good reason. If you take a mitten off to fix a tool and the wind blows it away, you are essentially looking at a future with 9 fingers. Everything is tethered. Everything is deliberate. The relaxed look of the nomadic life is actually a facade. Every stitch is a calculation made against the threat of amputation. There's a sensory richness to this gear that you can't get from a Gore-Tex jacket. There's a thrum of the leather as you move, the soft hiss of the fur brushing against itself, and the incredible weight of it. A full winter outfit might weigh 25 pounds. It's a burden, yes, but it's a warm burden. When you sit down in the teepee, you don't even need to take it all off. You just loosen the waist belt, the cinch, to let the heat from the fire circulate up through your layers. Your clothes are an extension of the teepee's architecture. You are a walking, breathing, leather-wrapped furnace. As you sit by the fire, you run your fingers over the quill work on your sleeve. You realize that this clothing represents hundreds of hours of labor. The buffalo had to be hunted, the hide tanned, the quills dyed and flattened, and the seams sewn with sinew. It's slow fashion at its most extreme. In our world, we discard clothes because they go out of style. Here you wear your clothes until they become a part of you, repairing them with the same sinew that held the animal together. You aren't just wearing a brand, you are wearing a biography. The smell of the leather, that familiar mix of smoke and brain tannin, is stronger now that you're warm. It's a comforting animal scent. It reminds you that you aren't an alien in this environment. You are wearing the environment. You've taken the protection the buffalo used to survive the plains and you've adapted it for yourself. You take a deep breath, the wolverine fur tickling your nose, and you realize that as long as you stay inside this leather skin, the 30-degree C world is just a movie playing on the other side of the door. You are safe in your mobile, wearable fortress. The storm outside shows no signs of fatigue, but inside the teepee, the world has shrunk to a 10-foot circle of firelight and faces. You've mastered the heat, the housing, and the gear, but now you face the most subtle enemy of the winter plains, the big dark. When the sun sets at 4 p.m. and doesn't return for 16 hours, and when the snow makes venturing outside a lethal gamble, you are faced with the psychological pressure that could easily turn into cabin fever. In our world, we fight this with glowing blue screens and endless streams of digital noise. Here, the bandwidth is purely human. You are entering the season of the storytellers, where oral history becomes the glue that holds your sanity together. You lean back against your willow backrest, the fire casting long, flickering shadows that stretch up towards the smoke hole. This is the time for winter counts and legend weaving. A mainstream historical fact you might be aware of is that many plains tribes had a strict seasonal law for storytelling. Certain sacred stories, particularly those involving powerful spirits or Coyote the Trickster, could only be told in the winter when the snakes and other hibernating creatures were underground and couldn't overhear them. To tell them in the summer was to risk bad luck or a literal strike of lightning. This created a massive cultural backlog. By the time the first blizzard hit, everyone was starving for the narrative content that had been forbidden for months. The winter count itself is a fascinating piece of historical technology. You see an elder unroll a large, specially tanned buffalo hide. It's covered in spiral patterns of small, red and black pictograms. This isn't just art, it's a chronological database. Each symbol represents the most significant event of a single year, a starfall, a great hunt, or perhaps a year of deep snow like this one. Historians still argue whether these winter counts were meant to be exhaustive archives or merely index files, designed to jog the memory of the keeper, who would then recite the full oral history. Some scholars believe that different keepers might interpret the same symbol differently, leading to a dynamic, living history rather than a static one. It's like having a hard drive where the data actually changes and grows more complex every time you access it. Here's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit that highlights a dark humor of the Winter Lodge. The coyote tales often served as a form of social debugging. If someone in the camp was being particularly greedy or lazy, the storyteller wouldn't call them out directly. That would be rude and cause friction in a cramped space. Instead, they would tell a story about Coyote being greedy or lazy and getting his tail stuck in a frozen pond or being tricked by a rabbit. The offender would sit there in the firelight, hearing their own bad behavior satirized in front of everyone. and they'd have to laugh along while taking the hint. It was cancel culture, but with more nuance and better metaphors. It kept the social peace without the need for a police force. You watch the gestures of the storyteller. Their hands move in a rhythmic, hypnotic dance, almost like they are weaving the smoke into shapes. The language is tonal and rich, punctuated by the snap of the fire. Even if you don't understand every word, the cadence is soothing. It lowers your heart rate. You realize that this is more than entertainment. It's a survival mechanism. By recounting the history of the ancestors, how they survived even worse winters, how they outsmarted the winter man, the tribe is reinforcing its collective resilience. You aren't just a cold person in a tent. You are a link in a chain that stretches back 10,000 years. As the night deepens, the tone shifts from history to the surreal. You hear stories of the thunderbirds and the little people. In the silence between the stories, the whoomph of the wind against the hides sounds like the breathing of a giant. Without the distractions of the modern world, your imagination becomes hyper vivid. You start to see faces in the pattern of the lodge poles. The asleep world and the awake world start to bleed together. This is the ASMR of the 1700s, the soft voice of the elder, the crackle of the embers, and the heavy weight of the buffalo robe creating a sensory cocoon. Historians often focus on the physical artifacts of the plains, the arrowheads and the tipis, but the real infrastructure of the winter was this shared mental landscape. If you lose your stories, you lose your reason to keep fighting the 30-degree-C cold. You notice the children in the lodge. They are listening with wide eyes, absorbing the entire legal, moral, and historical code of their people through these tales. There are no textbooks here, just the audiobook of the elders. It's an incredibly efficient way to pass on complex information without a single sheet of paper. There's a playful side to the evening too. You might participate in a hand game or a stick game, a complex betting game involving hidden objects and rhythmic singing. It's the 18th century equivalent of a high-stakes poker tournament, but played with bone slivers and plum pits. The competition is fierce but friendly. It burns off the restless energy that comes from being trapped in a small circle. You find yourself laughing, the tension of the storm outside forgotten. The dark humor comes out, jokes about whose feet smell the worst, usually the guy sitting closest to the fire, or who's going to have to do the first wood run in the morning. As the fire burns down to a bed of glowing coals, the storytelling transitions into a low, rhythmic chant or a lullaby. The bandwidth of the lodge narrows. People begin to drift off into their fur nests. You realize that you've just spent 6 hours offline, and yet you feel more connected than you ever have in front of a computer screen. The social engineering of the teepee is just as impressive as its thermal engineering. It forces you to look at each other, to listen to each other, and to remember that you are part of a whole. You settle into your robe, the last story of the night still echoing in your mind. It was a story about how the sun is actually a fire in a great celestial teepee, and the stars are just the sparks escaping through the smoke hole. You look up and see a single star through the top of your lodge, and for a moment, you believe it. The big dark isn't a void anymore, it's a library. You close your eyes, the safety of the group acting as a final layer of insulation, and prepare to dream in the language of the plains. As the sun, or at least a pale, watery suggestion of it, begins to bleed through the amber hides of the teepee, you are forced to confront the less poetic, grittier side of survival, winter hygiene. In the modern world, we associate cleanliness with hot showers, porcelain tiles, and a collection of plastic bottles that smell like ocean breeze or Arctic blast. Out here, the Arctic blast is currently trying to rip your roof off, and ocean breeze is just another way of saying you're about to get hypothermia. You're living in a 10-foot circle with multiple people, several dogs, and a floor made of organic materials, all while the outside world is a frozen wasteland. If you don't manage the human element, your cozy sanctuary will quickly become a pungent biohazard. You sit up in your robe, and the first thing you notice is the gristle of life. There is a fine layer of soot on almost everything, a gift from the central fire. Managing this is a daily ritual. You don't have a vacuum cleaner, you have a bunch of stiff grass or a turkey wing fan. You sweep the living area around the fire, pushing the dust and debris toward the perimeter, under the inner liner. This might seem like just moving the mess around, but remember that the gap between the liner and the outer wall is a high traffic air zone. By moving dust there, you're actually allowing the rising air current to pull the lighter particulates up and out the smoke hole. It's a passive, convection-powered air filtration system. A mainstream historical fact you'll find in early frontier accounts is that the Plains tribes were surprisingly obsessed with personal grooming, even in the dead of winter. Hair was kept meticulously braided and often greased with buffalo fat or scented with sweetgrass to keep it from becoming a matted mess under your winter cap. But the real challenge was bathing. You aren't going to jump into a frozen river unless you have a death wish. Instead, you use the dry wash method. You take a handful of fine dry sand or a specific type of porous volcanic rock and scrub your skin. It exfoliates and removes the oils and salt from your sweat. It's essentially the 18th century version of dry shampoo, but for your entire body. It sounds scratchy, but it's remarkably effective at keeping you from feeling grimy. Here's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit that sounds like a modern spa treatment: the snow steam bath. In some northern tribes, if the weather broke slightly, they would heat stones in the teepee fire until they were glowing red, then carry them into a smaller, tightly sealed sweat lodge, or even just a very small, temporary teepee. They would pour water, melted snow over the stones. In 30°C weather, the resulting steam would be so intense it could practically peel the skin off your back. Afterward, you'd step out into the freezing air, and for a few seconds, the steam trapped against your skin would act as a thermal buffer, allowing you to rub down with fresh snow before ducking back into your warm furs. It's the original Finnish sauna experience, but with more buffalo robes and significantly higher stakes. Historians still argue whether the high prevalence of certain respiratory issues in winter camps was due to the soot load from the fires or the cramped living conditions that allowed viruses to run rampant. Some argue that the constant airflow from the inner liner design actually kept the air cleaner than in a modern airtight apartment, while others point out that burning buffalo chips, dung, released particulates that wouldn't exactly be cleared by the FDA today. Either way, you manage your indoor air quality by carefully adjusting those smoke flaps we talked about. If the air feels heavy, you open the flaps wider, even if it means losing a bit of heat. A headache in a teepee is a warning sign that the air is stale, and out here, you listen to your body like a mechanic listens to a finicky engine. Then there's the bathroom situation. This is the part of history documentaries usually gloss over with a quick fade to black. At 30°C, a trip to the facilities is an Olympic-level athletic event. You don't just wander out into the snow, you have a designated area away from the camp, usually downwind. You go in pairs or groups, partly for safety against predators and partly so someone can hold a rope to break the wind. It is the fastest you will ever move in your entire life. You use soft moss, dried grass, or even smooth stones. It's a brutal reminder that you are still an animal, no matter how sophisticated your teepee is. Inside the lodge, you have to manage your trash. In a nomadic society, trash is a very different concept. Almost everything is biodegradable or recyclable. A broken bone tool becomes a scraper. A worn out hide becomes a patch or a pair of dolls' moccasins for a child. Anything that truly can be used is burned. The fire is your waste management system. The smell of the lodge, a mix of wood smoke, sweetgrass, dried meat, and human is something you eventually stop noticing. It just smells like home. It's a complex, layered scent that tells you everyone is alive and the environment is stable. You look at the dogs sleeping near the door. They serve a dual purpose. They are your alarm system and your room heaters, but they also act as the camp's janitors. Any scrap of food that falls on the floor is gone in seconds. It's a symbiotic relationship that keeps the lodge floor relatively clean. Of course, you have to deal with dog hair, but when you're already wearing 3 different types of animal fur, a little bit of canine fluff is the least of your worries. It's just more insulation. As you finish your morning grooming, perhaps using a small piece of polished obsidian or a traded mirror to check your braids, you realize that cleanliness here isn't about looking good for others. It's about maintenance. If your leather gear gets too oily or dirty, it loses its ability to breathe and trap air, which means it loses its ability to keep you warm. Hygiene is a structural requirement of your survival gear. You are detailing your own life support system. You take a deep breath of the smoky air. It's crisp and has a sharp tang to it. You feel remarkably refreshed, considering you're living in a leather cone in the middle of a frozen void. You realize that comfort isn't the absence of dirt, it's the presence of order. By keeping your small circle clean and your body maintained, you are asserting control over the chaos outside. You reach for your mittens, ready to face the chores of the day, feeling like a well-oiled machine in a world that is trying to grind you to a halt. The peace of the morning is shattered by a low, rhythmic signal passed from teepee to teepee. The decision has been made. It is time to move. You might think that dismantling your entire world when the temperature is 30 degrees Celsius and the snow is waist deep is an act of insanity, but out here, stagnation is a real killer. Perhaps the local firewood has been picked clean, or the buffalo have shifted 5 miles to a more sheltered coulee, or maybe the big cold is simply demanding a change in geography. Whatever the reason, the transition from a cozy anchored home to a mobile caravan in sub-zero temp is the ultimate test of your endurance and your engineering. You aren't just packing a bag. You are performing a synchronized, high-speed breakdown of a life support system while the environment is actively trying to freeze your joints in place. First, you have to deal with the banking. That protective ring of snow and ice you piled around the base of the teepee for insulation. It's now frozen as hard as concrete. You use a stone maul or a heavy branch to break it away, the shards of ice flying like glass. As soon as that seal is broken, the cold air rushes in, reclaiming the interior floor you've kept warm for weeks. It's a psychological blow, like someone ripping the blankets off you on a cold morning, but on a much more lethal scale. You work quickly, your movements fueled by the pemmican you ate earlier, knowing that the moment the fire is extinguished, the clock starts ticking on your core temperature. A mainstream historical fact you'll find in almost every account of the plains is the incredible speed of this process. A skilled group could have a large family teepee dismantled, the poles bundled, and the cover folded and loaded onto a travois in less than 20 minutes. This wasn't just for efficiency, it was a tactical necessity. In the winter, the sweat factor is your biggest enemy. If you work too slowly, you stay out in the wind longer. If you work too fast, you sweat, and that sweat will freeze as soon as you stop moving. You have to find that steady state rhythm, the Goldilocks zone of physical exertion. Here's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit. The way the teepee cover is folded is a specialized art form. You don't just wad it up like a dirty shirt. You fold it into a specific heavy rectangle that exposes only the smoked side of the leather to the elements. This ensures that the softer, inner side stays dry. If moisture gets trapped inside the folds and freezes, the cover becomes a rigid 200-pound block of ice that you can't unroll at the next camp without cracking the leather. Some elders believed that the way you folded your lodge reflected your mental state. A messy fold meant a messy mind. And in a blizzard, a messy mind is a dead mind. Historians still argue whether the extreme winter migrations were a sign of desperate food scarcity or a sophisticated strategy to avoid the parasite load that accumulated in a static winter camp. Some argue that moving in 30 was a last resort, while others suggest that nomadic tribes were so well adapted that moving camp was actually easier than trying to haul wood and water from increasingly long distances to a fixed point. It's a debate between seeing the tribes as struggling against the winter or dancing with it. When you're the one holding the frozen lodge poles, it certainly feels more like a struggle. But there is a brutal elegance to the coordination. The lodge poles are the most awkward part of the move. You can't just throw them in a pile. They are lashed together in two bundles to form a travois, the A-frame sled that is the backbone of plains transport. The thin ends of the poles are attached to the shoulders of a horse or a dog, while the heavy ends drag on the snow. You realize that the tilting design of the teepee we talked about earlier actually helps here. The poles have a natural curve and taper that makes them glide over the snow rather than digging in. You are literally dragging your house behind you, and the snow, which was your enemy this morning, is now your lubricant. The logistics of the move out are heartless. Small items are tucked into parfleche, tough rawhide envelopes that are essentially the 18th century version of plastic storage bins. Your bedding, your food, and your tools are all packed with zero wasted space. You look around the site of your home, and within 30 minutes, the only sign that you were ever there is a scorched circle of earth where the fire pit was and a few impressions in the snow. It's the ultimate leave no trace philosophy enforced by a climate that erases human history with a single gust of wind. Now comes a trudge. You are walking now, the wind hitting you with renewed ferocity because you no longer have a wall to hide behind. Your clothes, that multi-layered leather system, are now your only defense. You have to keep the dogs and horses moving. If an animal stops and lies down in this cold, it might never get back up. You watch the person in front of you, following their footsteps to save energy. The silence of the caravan is profound, broken only by the shush-shush of the travois poles on the crusty snow and the heavy breathing of the animals. There's a specific kind of winter blindness that sets in during these moves. The world is so white and the wind is so constant that you lose your sense of perspective. You start to feel like you're walking in place, a tiny fur-wrapped dot in an infinite frozen ocean. This is where the discipline of the tribe matters most. No one wanders off. No one lags behind. You are a single, moving organism. If the travois of one family breaks, the whole line stops. You help each other, not out of kindness in the modern sentimental sense, but out of a cold, hard understanding that if the chain breaks, everyone is in danger. As you move, you realize that your entire concept of home has changed. Home isn't a coordinate on a map or a foundation in the dirt. Home is the bundle of poles dragging behind the dog. Home is the folded hide on the sled. Home is whatever space you can clear of snow and set up before the sun goes down. You feel a strange sense of freedom in this. You aren't tethered to the earth. You are a ghost in the machine of the plains. You take a deep breath of the freezing air, your lungs burning, and you keep walking. The next camp is 5 miles away, and in this weather, 5 miles is a lifetime. The caravan stretches out across the frozen white expanse, a long, dark ribbon of life cutting through an environment that feels increasingly like the surface of the moon. As you trudge forward, your attention shifts from your own freezing toes to the true unsung heroes of this sub-zero migration, the dogs. In the modern world, we think of dogs as man's best friend, creatures that sleep on our couches and occasionally wear embarrassing sweaters. But out here, In the pre-horse or horse-limited era of the plains, the dog is not a pet. It is a high-performance biological engine. These are the freight trains of the prairie, and without their four-legged strength, you wouldn't be moving your teepee. You'd be abandoning it. You look down at the dog pulling your family's secondary travois. It's a sturdy, thick-furred creature, a descendant of wolves with a chest as broad as a barrel and eyes that seem to hold a certain weary intelligence. It doesn't bark or complain, it just leans into the leather harness, its paws finding purchase on the slick, wind-swept crust of the snow. This is canine power, the original horsepower. A single dog, weighing maybe 60 to 80 pounds, can haul a travois loaded with nearly twice its own body weight. It's an incredible feat of biomechanics. The travois itself, those two long poles crossed over the dog's shoulders, is a stroke of engineering genius for this terrain. Unlike a wheeled cart, which would sink and get stuck in the drifts, the travois acts like a pair of giant skis, distributing the weight across a large surface area. A mainstream historical fact you might encounter is that before the arrival and widespread use of the horse in the 1700s, the dog days were the standard for all plains cultures. Tribes owned hundreds of dogs, and a family's wealth was often measured by how many healthy working canines they could maintain. While horses eventually took over the heavy lifting, dogs remained essential in the winter because they're much hardier in the extreme cold. A horse's thin legs can break in a hidden, snow-filled badger hole, and their caloric needs are massive. A dog, however, can curl up in a ball, cover its nose with its tail, and sleep right on the snow. They are the ultimate low-maintenance transport tech. Here's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit. The relationship between the people and their working dogs was one of intense mutual respect, but it wasn't cuddly. These dogs were often fed better than some of the humans during a lean winter, receiving the choice scraps of buffalo fat and organ meat. Why? Because a starving dog can't pull a house. There are even accounts of dog moccasins, tiny leather booties stitched from scrap hide and tied around the dog's paws to protect them from ice cutting, where the sharp crust of the snow can slice their pads like a razor. It's a bizarre and touching image. A hardened warrior kneeling in a 30 degrees gale to tie little shoes on. A dog. But out here, that dog's health is your health. Historians still argue whether the transition from dog-based transport to horse-based transport actually made the tribes more vulnerable to extreme winters. Some argue that because horses required so much more forage, which is hard to find under 3 feet of snow, the tribes were forced to move into more dangerous, exposed areas to find grazing land, whereas the dog-based cultures could tuck themselves into deep, sheltered woods and stay put. The dog allowed for a more compact and perhaps more resilient winter survival strategy. It's a fascinating debate about how technology, even biological technology, always comes with a trade-off. You watch as a dog's breath plumes out in thick white clouds. It's working hard, but its thick double coat, the coarse guard hairs, and the dense woolly undercoat keeps its body heat trapped perfectly. This is the same principle as your buffalo robes. Nature solved the insulation problem long before humans started brain tanning hides. You feel a strange sense of kinship with the animal. You are both just biological machines trying to keep your internal temperature at 37-degree Celsius, while the world is trying to drag you down to 30-degree Celsius. The sound of the winter caravan is dominated by the dogs. It's a constant shush shush of the poles, the occasional low growl as a dog adjusts its position in line, and the rhythmic pant 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 of their breathing. There's a psychological comfort to it. As long as the dogs are moving, the tribe is moving. If the dogs start to falter, you know you're in real trouble. You reach down and give the lead dog a quick, firm pat on his shoulder as you walk. It doesn't wag its tail. It's too busy working for that, but it leans slightly into your hand. It's a silent acknowledgement of the contract. I pull your home, and you keep me fed and out of the wind. As the afternoon light begins to fail, the caravan slows. You've reached a new site, a small grove of stunted trees near a frozen spring. The dogs are immediately unhitched. They don't wait for instructions. They immediately start digging snow nests, circular hollows in the drifts where they can escape the wind. You watch them disappear into the white, only their ears occasionally twitching above the snow line. They are now part of the insulation of the camp. In some of the coldest nights, dogs were even brought inside the teepee to sleep near the door, acting as living heaters and an extra layer of defense against intruders. You realize that man-made survival is a myth. You didn't survive this move because of your own strength alone. You survived because of the synergy between your engineering, the travois, and the harness, and the evolutionary perfection of the dog. You stand there for a moment, the wind whipping your robe, looking at the bundled poles of your home. The dogs have done their job. Now it's your turn to rebuild the world. There's deep primal satisfaction in seeing the dogs settle. They represent the endurance of life. Even in this void, where nothing grows and the air itself is a threat, these animals thrive. They are the traction control of the Great Plains. You turn your back to the wind and begin the process of unrolling the hides. The shush of the travois now replaced by the thud of the lodge poles hitting the snow. The cycle begins again. The dogs have brought you to safety, and tonight they will sleep as deeply as you do, dreaming of the summer grass while the winter stars watch over the camp. You stand in the center of a new empty circle of snow, and for a moment, the silence is heavier than the cold. The migration is over. The dogs are resting. The travois have been unburdened, and now come the final, most critical act of the day: resurrecting your sanctuary. You work with a speed that is almost frantic, yet perfectly disciplined. The lodge poles go up first, the tripod locking into place against the darkening sky. Then the hide cover is hoisted, a massive frozen sail that you wrestle into position until it settles over the wooden ribs with a satisfying, heavy thwack. You peg it down, bank the snow around the base, and step inside. It is freezing, dark, and smells of ancient frost, but it is home. You strike a spark. It's a delicate, high-stakes moment where you lean over a tiny nest of dry grass and punky wood, shielding it with your body. The first orange glow reflects in your eyes, and as the flame catches a sliver of cedar, you feel the tension leave your shoulders. The fire grows, the wheel of logs is set, and the stones of the hearth begin their slow thermal climb. As the heat rises, the inner liner begins to do its work, creating that invisible curtain of air that pushes the chill back toward the walls. You sit down, finally, on the stack of buffalo robes that haven't even had time to warm up yet, and you realize you've done it. You've successfully moved an entire household through a 30-degree cod void and cheated the big dark one more time. A mainstream historical fact you should hold on to is that the teepee was one of the few structures in human history that achieved a near-perfect balance of portability and thermal efficiency. While other cultures built permanent stone or wood houses that were warmer but trapped them in one place, or used light tents that were portable but cold, the Plains tribes created a mobile fortress. This architectural flexibility allowed them to dominate the center of the North American continent for millennia. Historians still argue whether the golden age of the teepee was truly the horse era, or if the pre-colonial periods, with their smaller, dog-pulled lodges, actually represented a more stable and sustainable way of life. Some argue that the larger horse teepees were harder to heat and required more labor, making the smaller, older designs the true masterpieces of survival. Here's a quirky and somewhat fringe tidbit to carry with you. Some tribes believed that the fire in the center of the teepee was a living being that needed to sleep just like the people, Before bed, they would perform a ritual called covering the fire, where the embers were buried under a layer of ash to keep them glowing until morning. They didn't just see it as a chemical reaction, they saw it as a guest that had to be treated with respect. If the fire died, it was a bad omen for the family's spirit. Looking at the glowing red heart of your hearth right now, it's hard to disagree. It feels like the only soul in the room besides your own. As the heat intensifies, you begin to shed your layers. The capote, the heavy mittens, the overshoes, they all come off, revealing the soft, brain-tan leather beneath. You feel the moisture on your skin evaporate into the dry, smoky air. You reach for a piece of pemmican, the fat melting instantly, sending a final surge of warmth to your fingertips. You look up through the smoke hole. The flaps are set perfectly. The smoke is a straight, silver needle piercing the night. Outside, the wind is still there. You can hear it rubbing against the hides like a frustrated predator. But in here, you are the master of the elements. There is a profound sense of enoughness in this moment. You don't have much, just some poles, some skins, a few tools, and a fire. But you have everything you need to thrive in a place where most things come to die. You realize that the Native Americans who built these structures weren't struggling against nature. They were in a deep technical conversation with it. They understood the wind, the wood, the animal, and the flame. They didn't build walls to shut the world out. They built a shape that let the world move through it without taking their lives in the process. You lie back on your buffalo robe, the hair side in warmth embracing you like a familiar friend. The ozone canopy above you is a soft amber ceiling, reflecting the rhythmic pulse of the embers. You feel the weight of your own body sinking into the furs, the permafrost far below you, unable to reach through the layers of reeds and hide. You are a part of the landscape now, a tiny pocket of 20 degrees Celsius air in a world of 30 degrees Celsius. You've earned this sleep. Every calorie spent, every mile trudged, and every log scavenged has led to the specific quiet victory. The fire is sinking now. The logs have burned down to a deep, pulsing crimson that casts a soft, heavy light across the lodge. You can feel the silence of the snow outside, a vast, muffling blanket that has settled over the entire world, turning the plains into a cathedral of ice. The wind has dropped to a low, melodic whisper, a gentle brushing sound against the leather walls that sounds like a long, slow breath. You are safe. You are warm. The rhythm of your breathing begins to slow, matching the steady, calm heartbeat of the fire. Imagine the smoke drifting lazily upward, caught in the gentle draft, rising past the lodge poles and out into the infinite starlit sky. The stars out here are so bright they look like holes poked in a velvet curtain, letting the light of another world leak through. You are tucked away in your fur nest, the weight of the buffalo robes pressing down on you with a comforting, protective heaviness. Your feet are warm, your hands are soft, and the smell of the sweet grass and cedar is like a gentle hand stroking your brow. The darkness is not a void, it is a soft, warm room. Every shadow is a story, and every ember is a promise of tomorrow's sun. You feel the edges of your consciousness beginning to fray, drifting away like the sparks from the hearth. There is nothing left to do. The dogs are asleep, the caravan is still, and the winter is held at bay by the simple, ancient genius of the cone and the flame. You are sinking deeper into the furs, the warmth of the earth rising up to meet you as the world outside fades into a soft, white blur. The journey is over for today. The lodge is holding you. The fire is watching. Everything is exactly as it should be.